Hello, friends. Father Frank Pavone here, National Director of Priests for Life. Welcome to EndAbortion.tv and to this episode in this educational series about the Supreme Court abortion case, the Dobbs case out of Mississippi, which is looking at the important question of whether bans on abortion prior to viability are unconstitutional. This is one of the most important cases that the court has heard since Roe versus Wade. This is going to be very consequential for abortion policy in the United States. And so many different pro-life and pro-family organizations have submitted friend of the court briefs in this case, including Priests for Life. And each of these programs is focusing on another one of those briefs so that you and many others can understand the arguments that are being made to the court on behalf of our youngest brothers and sisters, the unborn, and in fact, on behalf of their moms, families, and our whole society. Well, the Cntr for Family and Human Rights, or CFAM as it's called, has been a friend and colleague for many, many years. We at Priests for Life have had much active collaboration with this group here in the United States, at the United Nations, where the pro-life fight is very intense on the international level. And we're very happy to have with us here today one of the drafters of their brief to the Supreme Court, Stefano Gennarini. Let me say something about him. He's Vice President for Legal Studies at the Cntr for Family and Human Rights, represents CFAM at the UN headquarters in New York, and does a lot of research and writing on international policy for the organization, fighting for our issues and fighting for the unborn in the international arena. Stefano, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Father Frank. I'm delighted to be with you.
It's so good to read this brief. I really enjoyed this brief, and there's some unique features to it that I want to help our audience to understand. You basically go to the Supreme Court in this brief and make an argument from the international arena. And that's very interesting. Most of the briefs, of course, are talking about it simply from the point of view of course, the U.S. Constitution, changes that have taken place domestically in the United States in both law and culture and science. And all of these, of course, are very valid and powerful arguments. But you and CFAM have come at this from the international perspective, which is also very strong and valid. And I want to start out helping our viewers understand why that's true by asking you this. When we talk about the law of the land, the supreme law of the land, the Constitution of the United States actually tells us what the supreme law of the land is. And along with the Constitution, and along with federal law, it mentions treaties, international treaties. Could we begin by having you explain to us the nature of treaties that the United States enters into and how that actually forms part of what we call the law of the land?
Certainly. So, yes, so the Constitution says that international law, specifically treaty law, that is international treaties that have been signed and ratified by the United States, are part of what constitutes the supreme law of the land. So it has the highest possible standing, a legal standing in a court of law. And of course, the United States has ratified several international treaties with other countries on a host of subjects, including the international cooperation, arms treaties, and law of the sea, many different types of international treaties. Amongst these are also human rights treaties. The United States has ratified specifically the treaty that we mentioned in the brief is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is actually a human rights treaty that the United States has promoted for within the United Nations system since 1948, since the system was founded, and ratified finally in 1991.
It's fascinating, that there are so many of these international documents. So we at Priests for Life have used these in the context of educating people about the right to life, because, as you know, many of these documents mention the right to life. They mention even the rights of children, both before and after birth. So let's take a closer look at this. First of all, could you tell us the different types? I know that some of these documents are called declarations, others are called covenants, others are called conventions. Give us an idea of the different types of these documents.
So the nomenclature doesn't really matter that much, actually. You may have a declaration that has a status of a treaty, or you may have a treaty that only has the standing of a political declaration. So the nomenclature is not what really matters. What really matters is the effect of the document and what it prescribes. In this case, for example, in the case of human rights treaties, there are covenants that are binding treaties. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I mean, the choice of the word is deliberate. It has even biblical evocations in some ways.
Right.
The International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. There are these two covenants on economic and social rights, and the Treaty on Civil and Political Rights, which have always been considered founding UN treaties from which all the other human rights treaties derive. So perhaps the choice of the word covenant was because of that important status of these two international treaties.
So the United States, in other words, has signed on to this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says in part, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life, and it speaks about an inherent right to life. So in your brief to the Supreme Court, what are you asking the court to do in regard to the fact that the U.S. has already signed on to this document?
So we think it would be prudent and it would be advisable that the Supreme Court should actually make a finding of law with regards to the status of the unborn in international human rights law, and specifically with regards to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the international human rights treaty which most properly protects the right to life of every individual, is that no individual should be arbitrarily deprived of the right to life. Of course, the covenant uses an even broader term that uses the word human being, and in its preamble, it talks about all members of the human family. So it has a very broad nomenclature, of course, because the intention of the framers of the treaty was to be as inclusive as possible. They didn't want to exclude anybody from the protection of the right to life. And the debates surrounding the adoption of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights show that, in fact, the framers of the covenant overwhelmingly believed that the protections of the covenant should apply also to children before birth, while they were in the womb. And there are debates that have been studied in detail by scholars showing this. So what we are asking the Supreme Court to do is to recognize this, to recognize that, in effect, the Mississippi law protecting children from the moment that they feel pain, and it might as well apply also from the moment that you can detect a heartbeat, as in the case of the Texas law, that these laws are indeed consistent with the international human rights obligations of the United States. And we believe this is important because the Supreme Court very rarely ever gets to opine on what the international obligations of the United States under human rights law are. And there's an entire debate about international law that is completely excluding the Supreme Court, and we don't think that's correct, given the authority of the Supreme Court under the Constitution, which is to declare what the law is.
You know, as you bring up in the brief also, there is another document, the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. which was followed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I love this quote, I've used it so often. The child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturity, needs special safeguards and care, including appropriate legal protection before as well as after birth. So here we have, and of course, as you know, there's many other documents too, that are really strengthening this argument that there is a consensus on the international level that number one, there is a right to life. Number two, it is inherent. Number three, it applies to every member of the human species, including children in the womb. And yet we know that the battle, as you've already referred to, is so intense on the international level. And we even see, and we see groups like Planned Parenthood and its allies in the arena of the United Nations trying to push exactly the opposite message, that there is some kind of international right to abortion, and they're trying to push this consensus that, well, I mean, basically it would be like peer pressure. If we can get enough nations to acknowledge that, it's an international right to abortion, then it sort of embarrasses other countries if they try to protect the unborn. Now, CFAM, along with Priests for Life, along with so many other pro-life groups, have been shoulder to shoulder in this battle on the international level. And we've had quite a bit of success, haven't we, in pushing back the idea that there's some kind of international right to abortion. Tell us a little bit about that battle, the success we've had in that battle, and how that strengthens your argument in this brief.
So the International Planned Parenthood, or the global abortion industry, as we like to say, because it's not just Planned Parenthood, but other organizations, powerful foundations that give a lot of money to the developing world. They are promoting abortion internationally, and they have the help of many countries, mostly Northern European countries. We're talking about France, the Netherlands, Germany, the United Kingdom, as well as Nordic countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, etc., Iceland. These countries are actively promoting an international right to abortion. Several of these countries, I would say most aggressively, the United Kingdom, France, and Norway, have been promoting the view that abortion is an international right. They actually say it outright in UN meetings, including in the Security Council, the General Assembly, and other UN fora. But you don't get that much pushback on the other side, though. You don't get so many countries saying that abortion is not an international right that often. A recent exception, of course, was under the Trump administration. The United States led another 34 countries to a declaration on women's health and protection of the family, which affirms that abortion is not an international right. So I don't think that the other side, those promoting abortion, ever have had that many supporters. What they have been successful in doing, though, is sort of creating euphemisms to promote abortion without saying the word abortion, without saying specifically that abortion is an international right. And so they hide behind terms like sexual and reproductive health, as well as reproductive rights. And the adoption of these terms repeatedly in UN documents has had the effect of giving the global abortion industry a steady financial source, as well as a steady source of political support over the last 20 years. And that's really what we're up against. They like to hide behind these euphemisms. If they were to be open about their intentions about establishing an international right to abortion and getting a declaration explicitly to that effect, they would not be that successful. They wouldn't have that much support.
Right. Well, for those of you that are just joining us, friends, we're talking about a brief to the United States Supreme Court in the Dobbs abortion case that has been submitted by CFAM, the Center for Family and Human Rights. We're talking with their Vice President of Legal Studies, Stefano Gennarini, who is one of the drafters of this brief that I have in front of me, which makes the argument that the Supreme Court really should clarify that according to international treaty law, we do affirm the rights of the unborn child. It's certainly consistent with the way these treaties have been interpreted, and Stefano, I want to go into two other arguments that the brief makes as to why it's a good idea for the court to do this, because first of all, and we were starting to talk about it just now with this push for, an international right to abortion. If the court does not weigh in on this question of certain international treaties, including the unborn in protection, then what can happen is that international entities will try to interfere with the United States public policy on abortion. This kind of pressure can be brought to bear. And the brief is saying, hey, listen, let's be clear and strong in what our position is in regard to the international scene. And secondly, it talks about consistency in the behavior of the executive branch. Now, those who are watching that follow the pro-life movement, we know so well whenever the White House changes hands in terms of party affiliation, things like the Mexico City policy is like a ping pong ball going back and forth. Either it's in effect or it's rescinded, or then it goes back into effect. And a lot of other international funding and our position at the United Nations on abortion just keeps going back and forth. There's this inconsistency on the part of the executive branch, and if I'm understanding the argument of the brief properly, the Supreme Court weighing in on this would give the basis, at least, for more consistency in this arena. Could you explain a little more these two arguments in the brief?
Sure. So the first argument is that there's an entire conversation about human rights, including what are the rights of children in the womb, and that has been going on internationally for years, for decades. And the Supreme Court has never been called to weigh in on this debate. And as the branch of the federal government with the constitutional authority to declare what the law is, as Marbury versus Madison established over 200 years ago, the Supreme Court should weigh in on this debate and should declare whether or not children in the womb are entitled to protections under international law. And certainly, perhaps even more importantly, from a foreign policy perspective or from the point of view of international relations, the court should consider whether laws to protect the unborn are consistent with international human rights law, because if it does not, first, it will expose itself to accusations of ignoring fundamental human rights obligations of the United States, of not, and this will have repercussions not just for the court, but for the federal government more broadly, which is already internationally accused of not respecting human rights law, including the obligations that the United States has itself undertaken in international human rights treaties. So that's one argument from the point of view simply of the politics of it that the Supreme Court should listen to. Of course, even there's also the point that international human rights law actually favors the protection of life, and so it would be important to incorporate that into the reflections for the pro-life movement more broadly. You may or may not know, of course, in conservative circles generally, where the pro-life sentiment generally is higher, in conservative circles, international obligations aren't really considered important. You
Right.
talk about international law and people's eyes gloss over, and they're like, oh,
Right.
yes, some weird thing that goes on at the United Nations international, but it doesn't have any real teeth. Except the problem is the rest of the world is heavily invested in international law and in the international system. And
Yes.
therefore, it's very important for the United States to not present itself as essentially being lawless. So from the point of view of international human rights law, there certainly is that argument. And with regards to other interference by international mechanisms in internal U.S. politics, there's also that. Of course, we hear routinely that the United Nations mechanisms are interfering in internal U.S. politics with regards to abortion policy. It happened in New York State with the Reproductive Health Act, which made abortion legal up until the moment of birth 3 years ago. It happened during COVID when several UN human rights experts wrote to the State Department asking for a clarification or demanding a clarification as to why certain states, including Texas and Oklahoma, and I think it was 4 or 5 others, had not included sexual and reproductive health as essential services that could not be interrupted during the COVID pandemic. So you have this interference by international experts purporting to tell the U.S. government what its obligations are under international human rights law. And, you know, the executive branch is going to have a say. They're going to have to respond to those international mechanisms. And to some degree, also the legislative branch may have a say. But it seems that the U.S. Supreme Court is never being asked to have a say about what international human rights law says or does not say about the obligations of the United States. And we think it's important, especially given the constitution of the court right now, for the court to make a pronouncement on this, because as you said, you know, there can be a change of position in the executive branch, in the legislative branch. But if we don't want to be a country that is lawless, we have to look at our international human rights obligations seriously, and they can't change with every changing administration. So, you know, and if you look at what the United States has said in recent years about abortion and international law, you'll find that the Trump administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Clinton administration all recognized that abortion was not an international right. And they did so in official international forum. With the Biden administration, we are seeing a change in that. The Biden administration is changing position. And for the first time, we are seeing a U.S. administration taking sort of positions that not defending, for example, the Helms Amendment internationally. Right. And as you know, also the Democratic Party more broadly is declaring that abortion is an international human right. They've proposed, several Democrats have proposed legislation in Congress to that effect. So there's a debate going on. It's happening in the executive branch, it's happening in the legislative branch, but nobody knows objectively, legally speaking, what the obligations of the United States are with regards to protections of the unborn. And so it would be helpful for the Supreme Court to have a say.
A very good argument, a very timely argument. And, you know, finally, Stefano, could you give our listeners a sense of how extreme our abortion policy is vis-a-vis the other nations? Because, I mean, this case at the Supreme Court right now is dealing with a law that in most other countries, the law itself would not be necessary. Protecting babies after 15 weeks of pregnancy. I mean, in most places, they're already protected. Am I right?
Yes. In most countries, you'll see that there are the laws do punish abortion in their criminal codes, and sometimes depending, mostly it's for against the doctors or people who procure the abortion. Sometimes also the woman has to face certain penalties. And then what happens is that you have a certain period of time, generally early in the pregnancy, where if a woman undergoes an abortion, it is not punished. Like the criminal code will say, this is an abortion that is not punished. But the understanding is generally that abortion is something dramatic and not something positive, not something certainly that we want to encourage. And if it takes place outside that window, it is considered a crime that is punished. In any case, it is considered a crime, but it's considered, you could say, an act of desperation, or and that's why it's not punished. The But what you have here in the United States is the idea of abortion on demand, which is something that did not exist in the world before 1973. It is absolutely something revolutionary, if you like, in the worst sense of that word,
Right.
because the idea that a woman can simply choose to abort her child would have been found, and it still is considered repugnant in many societies and cultures.
Yes, exactly. Well, thanks so much for the work that you do with CFAM and for this brief to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Center for Family and Human Rights, brothers and sisters, CFAM, you see the website there, c-fam.org. Check them out. They are friends and colleagues of ours and of many groups in the pro-life movement. Stefano Gennarini, Vice President for Legal Studies, thanks so much for explaining all this to us today.
Thank you, Father Frank.
Okay, friends, and remember, SupremeCourtVictory.com is a website where you can find links to all the different briefs in this case, including the one we just discussed, and where you can find our prayer campaign for victory in this Supreme Court case. So please go there on a regular basis, SupremeCourtVictory.com, and stay tuned for these episodes explaining more and more of the arguments being used in this case. God bless you all. Father Frank Pavone here, National Director of Priests for Life. Talk to you soon.